If I can have somebody as I pass along, if I can cheer somebody with a word of song, if I could show somebody is driving wrong, and my living will not be complete. If I can bring that feeling to a world of love, I can spread love and spirit that has never living down somebody has I passed along, then my living shall not be then my living shall not be in vain. Then living shall not be in vain. Somebody along the way, but my living is not. My living shall not. Then my living shall not be in
Good evening and welcome to Washington National Cathedral. My name is Randy Hollerith. I'm the Dean of the Cathedral, and thank all of you for tuning in to what I hope will be a really wonderful and important conversation here. There are many excellent institutions in this city that bring people together to talk about all kinds of subjects: leadership, public service, public policy, foreign policy, politics, you name it. All of these are important conversations, but we here at the Cathedral wanted to do something slightly different, something that could highlight the importance of faith and the spiritual life in conjunction with public service and leadership. As a result, our Honest to God series is designed as an opportunity for national or international thinkers and leaders of a variety of different faiths to share the ways in which their lives have been shaped by the practices of their faith, and consequently, how their faith shapes their work. This year, we are focused on the theme of healing the soul of the nation, at a time when we are more divided as Americans than ever, ideologically, economically, socially. What will it take to bring about healing, about reconciliation, about a deeper understanding of one another in our society? Tonight, our focus is on the economy. And in light of the Martin Luther King holiday we just celebrated, I'm reminded of a quote by Dr. King when he said, "God never intended for one group of people to live in superfluous, inordinate wealth while others live in abject and deadening poverty." And that certainly is the case in many parts of our world today. Tonight, I am thrilled to welcome Dr. Barbara Williams-Skinner and Dr. Arthur Brooks as our guests for this conversation. Both are people of deep and abiding faith, and I have great respect for both of them, and I'm honored that they would join me in this conversation. So first, I will be in conversation with Dr. Williams-Skinner for about 30 minutes, and then with Dr. Brooks for about 30 minutes, and then we will all come together for a little bit more conversation and to take some questions from you. So if you have questions that you would like to send in, I hope that you will. And so thank you for being with us. And finally, if prayer is something that is important in your life, I hope you'll join with me for a little bit of prayer. One of my very favorite prayers that I go to quite often, the prayer attributed to St. Francis. So let us pray. Lord, make us instruments of your peace. Where there is hatred, let us sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is discord, union. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is darkness, light. Where there is sadness, joy. Grant that we may not so much seek to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love. For it is in giving that we receive, it is in pardoning that we are pardoned, and it is in dying that we are born to eternal life. Amen. Dr. Williams-Skinner, welcome. We're so glad that you're with us this evening. Thank you for being here. Before we jump into our conversation, I thought I would tell folks a little bit about you. I've taken your biography and cut it down quite a bit, so forgive me, but I'm going to try to hit the highlights here. You have such an impressive biography and resume. Dr. Barbara Williams-Skinner is CEO and co-founder of the Skinner Leadership Institute. She is a trusted advisor and public policy strategist, faith and community leader, author, lecturer, educator, executive coach, and mentor. She and her late husband, Tom Skinner, founded the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation Prayer Breakfast that annually attracts over 3,000 leaders across the nation. She regularly works with interfaith leaders on issues like healthcare and criminal justice reform, and she's widely known as a committed prayer warrior. Dr. William Skinner regularly prays for and with congressional leaders and sends daily scriptures to many of them. She is co-founder of the Master's Series for Distinguished Leaders, a program equipping millennial leaders to move to the next levels of their lives and careers, and the Master's Series for Distinguished Clergy, which equips pastors with advocacy and media skills to voice their values in the public arena. Dr. William Skinner has authored I Prayed, Now What? And a companion discussion guide. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
Here so much, and thank you for being with us on Sunday.
I love the service.
It was a joy to have you here with us on that special day. So let me begin by asking, tell us a little bit about, if you wouldn't mind, a little bit about your faith journey, about how you have come to the place that you are right now in your life, given the work that you do, and how that faith has played a role for you. Now, I know that's a big question and only a little bit of time, but I think it's important.
Well, thank you. My journey, Dean Hollerith, is one from agnosticism, or no belief, really, in God, to Jesus. I was raised by an incredible prayer warrior mother, but I didn't understand how she could pray so long and there was no food on the table. 4th of 8 children, no father. So I didn't understand how God could be so big but deliver so little. So I became very angry as a very young girl, and at the age of 11 and a half, I told my mother, who was a very strict Southern mother, I'll take the punishment, but I'm not going back to church. And I did not, until I married and met Tom Skinner, the evangelist Tom Skinner. You know, God has a sense of humor. So I would say through college, which was my focus. My focus was really on education and power, getting power enough for poor people to move out of poverty. I was obsessed with that. Came to Washington, worked with members of Congress, and I think what happened is world travel, perfect life, all of a sudden nothing seemed to be working. You know how you've got everything but nothing? And I guess God knew. Well, my mother, when I told her I was leaving, I actually wrote a letter. My mother looked at the letter and said, I'm going to talk to God about you. And that's all she said. This is a very strict Southern mother who had no problems, you know, with the whipping, right? I think that she and God kept talking. So I believe that was probably the beginning of the wooing. I and Tom started the Skinner Leadership Institute. We committed ourselves to bringing people of all backgrounds and races together. And it's been an interesting journey, because on the one hand, I'm with African Americans, one day I'm with white evangelicals, the next day with Latinos, the other. It's kind of a crazy world, but they don't all come together. So my commitment really is just to find a way through the gospel to help people, not just believers, but people of good faith, to come together, to figure out how we address poverty and racism in our country.
How did you come, is a great, thank you for sharing that. Where did you grow up in the South?
In California, in Berkeley, Richmond, California. Yes.
Gotcha. And, so you grew up in California, but you had a Southern mother, so to speak.
Mother's from Louisiana.
Yeah, I got you, okay. That makes perfect sense. How did you reconcile the experience you had as a child of God being so big and yet you being so hungry, or you all having so little? How did God change for you into a God that brings about change or improvement or betterment?
I think I met Christ through Tom. I mean, Tom Skinner was not a preachy person. He was just practicing. He had a prison ministry, and he didn't have, a try God button on. He didn't talk about 4 spiritual laws. He was just actually, when I told a friend I was struggling, my life was falling apart, they introduced me to Tom. Not because of anything other than they thought Tom could help me Tom was a Redskin chaplain at the time, and he used to come in to town, and I love football. He asked me if I wanted to be part of a Bible study. I didn't even know what that was. And through the Bible study, it went on for 6 months. After 6 months, it was over. He said the Bible study could last for 6 months. I thought after 6 months, I was just getting started, so I asked him to marry me, and he said yes.
That's one way to have some Bible study.
I know, it was a great way to get a husband, you know. But the gap for me was closed through the embodiment of a person who showed love.
It was incarnational.
It was the incarnation.
Yeah.
I didn't want to hear about it on Sunday and not see it on Monday. But Tom was that to me until I got deep into the Word myself, and I can understand for myself that the Lordship of Jesus was that God does provide. You know, and He provides through people.
Right, exactly. For us being the hands and feet of Christ in the world, so to speak.
Absolutely. It's a long journey.
Thank you for sharing that. So let's jump into the economy and talk about the state of our nation. And as Christians, you know, we're always talking about and thinking about poverty and what we can do to eliminate poverty, to feed the hungry, to care for the naked, to visit the sick, you know, all of the things that Jesus teaches us to do. And it seems to me that the gap between the wealthiest Americans and those in the middle and lower tiers of the economy is growing. And we've seen that statistically. Why do you think that is? And what do you think the basis of the issue is with that?
Right. So first, I start everything with the foundation of the gospel. I think as believers, we have to start there. Our division is because we don't start there, okay? And the Word of God is very clear. God is not against wealth. We live in a capitalist society.
Right.
Innovation has helped us all, right? But God is against greed that produces injustice. So we have a country now that is structurally focused in inequalities of all types. I won't even talk yet about racial inequality, just inequality, where the wealth gap is growing. Today, it was reported today that the billionaire class made like $5 trillion or just during the pandemic when others were dying and sick and unemployed. There's something wrong with the structure that allows that. And then you look at the housing market. You look at the healthcare. You look at areas, you know, where people can't afford to send their children to college. So you have to ask yourself, what is the Christian responsibility, not just to feeding the poor, but dealing with structures that keep people poor? I believe we don't deal with the structures enough. You know, it's really ironic that Dr. King, at age 26, started his ministry when Rosa Parks in 1955, right, was arrested, and he was asked to lead a movement. He was 26 years of age. That was around the Montgomery bus boycott, where people could buy, but they couldn't work in Montgomery, so the boycott started. He ended his life working on behalf of sanitation workers. So he was always dealing with the structure of inequality. Inequality is a system. It's not an attitude, but it's how we devalue people. We don't think about the image of God in people. We value wealthy people. We value people with a lot more education than people with no or little education. So once you devalue people, the structure then is easy for people in power to put in place. And I don't think his people are evil. I think greed is a reality. I think we're fallen by nature. But the truth of the matter is that the church focuses more on the symptoms than on the systems of inequality. For example, churches do a great job when they see that children can't read well in a neighborhood. So we have after-school tutorial programs. But what if the school is so bad it needs to be eliminated? We do a lot to feed the poor, or let's say the homeless. But what about mental health issues? What about housing markets? What about job skills? What is it that makes people go from something to the streets? The systems. Jesus was dealing with the system when he turned over the tables in the market when they were mistreating the poor. He was dealing with the system of inequality. I think that's the issue that we're finding ourselves in today.
And how would you define that system? Do you have a way of pulling it together for folks who might want to understand more about what you mean by the system? I mean, we are a capitalist society,
right,
and we do believe in free markets and the things working in that way. So is the system an accidental thing, or is, I mean, simply a result of too much free market? Is it, I know that from a point of view of what African Americans have gone through in our nation since the beginning of it, there's so much of that inequality that was not accidental. It was quite purposeful. But if you take that aside, I don't even know if you can take that aside, but let's say we just bracket that for a moment. Do you think the system itself that causes this is an accidental result of that, or something? Is there a presence of evil in the midst of that? Do you understand what I'm saying?
We are fallen as a people.
Okay.
Okay. So fallen people do fallen things.
Right.
Greed, I'm told by people like Tony Hall, who was the ambassador for our country on dealing with homelessness many, many years ago. He said, we have enough grain, we have enough products for everybody, literally. We have enough to feed everybody, actually, in the world. It's not that we have a lack, it's that there are people who have more than they really need to. So we have policies that make it easy for people who have a lot of money to not pay taxes, while other people pay taxes. We have policies that make it easy for people to have a lot more than others. I'm saying the system is a policy, it's in a law. It's not bad people. I'm just saying that people are not perfect. They're fallen, right? The reason why the Bible in the Old Testament had programs like the gleaning program, where a farmer was told in the old text to go across the land once when they were harvesting and leave the rest for the poor, because I think God understood that people who are wealthy or powerful will always make it. They will always have enough. There's always a system, there's always a sense in the Bible that human dignity is more important than anything else. So the question is, how does our country with an economy as wealthy as ours allow 37 million people to be hungry? How do we allow children to be, the majority of those are children. How do we allow that? How can we be strong as a country when you have that many people going to bed hungry? You have 20 states right now with people making $7.25 an hour. That's $60 a day. That's $290 a week. That's $1,100 a month. Who can make it on that? That's a system. Those are policies. Mm-hmm. Those are laws. And I'm saying the church has to do more to address that. Mm. We have the power if we have the will.
Thank you. That was, I really appreciate that. I was playing devil's advocate a little bit in how I asked that question, but I thought it was important that you raised some of those things. So thank you for doing that. Now let's unbracket the issue of racial inequality in our country and talk a little bit about how that has played into how you understand this problem of our economic inequality.
So let's go from the system we just talked about, okay, that's built on structural inequalities. One of them is built on slave labor, okay? Mm-hmm. Fast forward to Reconstruction, okay? There's a whole series of policies going toward the Second World War where white people were not doing well, but there was the GI Bill, there was from the Homestead Act to the FHA loans to banking practices, even the Social Security Administration during Depression. 65% of black people were not able to get Social Security because they were domestic or farm workers. Okay, so that means we built in a way for some to have wealth and some not. Now you say, okay, that's the past. I wish that was true. Today, white people make more money even with the same income, same education level. So we're not talking about unequals, we're saying same level of education. So it ought to be concerning to us who say we love Jesus to say, what is fundamentally fair? And what is our collective responsibility? Not as Democrats or Republicans, not as whites, Asians, or whatever, Latino, but what do we owe to God to say, if it's a white poor person in the rural area, that's wrong. In Appalachia, if it's a Latino, a person who's stopped at the border, that's my responsibility. So structural inequality for everybody, yes, but then you add race to it. You have racial discrimination in housing. For example, in the appraisal market, it is shown that if I just bought a house in DC 3 years ago, and I love in the Hillcrest Heights area, and I love it. But what I learned in purchasing my house, that if I took a white person with me to have my house appraised, it would be appraised more. This is what a banking friend told me. Now, I could get angry about that, but that should be concerning to all Christians, that our banking, our housing, our healthcare system are unfair to any part of the body of Christ because human dignity is at stake. That's the issue.
It's amazing how much those biases, either consciously or unconsciously, still travel with us in such powerful ways as that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I love the fact that you are having this forum, because I think it helps us to ask some questions outside of our comfort zone to say, what is my responsibility now that I know, right? I know that I thought you'd love to see my Poverty and Justice Bible has 2,000 verses of scriptures on God's preferential concerns for the poor. And you see, it's marked. Anybody can see all of the yellow and orange spaces are scriptures on God's concerns for the poor. This has to be of concern to us, that injustice takes place. As Dr. King says, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Black and brown and Asians suffer this every day. It's like 1,000 cuts a day. It happens all the time. And I'm so grateful to you for having the conversation with me, because it's our collective responsibility to address fundamental inequalities that really matter to God.
You know, for many Christians, they very much are very passionate about wanting to help the homeless person who comes to the church door, or wanting to do what they can to do food banks or collect food for the poor, that sort of thing. But when we start talking about public policy or systemic issues, there tends to be a hesitancy to say, that's the political arena. Let's not go into the political arena. That's not where the church should be. What do you say to that sort of a reaction?
Well, then we would say that Jesus going into the temple, right, getting upset, turning over the money changers' tables because they were overpricing the poor who were getting their sacrifice. Was he being political? No, he's dealing with human dignity. That's what this is about. It is really about the fact that we have enough and we're blessed to be a blessing. The question is, how do we do that? So it's not political to make sure that the farmer who is poor and white eats. You notice during the pandemic, everybody, the pandemic didn't affect everybody the same. There really were two pandemics. But a lot of people who had a lot before, all of a sudden found themselves distressed. All of the power system didn't work anymore because of a pandemic. So the question is, do we have to have a crisis for us to see that we're really all in this together? And how do we get out of our black and white and brown and red and yellow box? It's our tribes that we're in that keep from saying that if it's a white child who's affected, it's my child who's being affected. Each child is all of our children, right? So we have a Congress right now that had no problem passing in 2017 $1.5 trillion tax cuts for the wealthy who didn't have a need. And now here we are, 4 years later, and we're struggling with a child tax credit for people making under, a certain income to make sure they can eat during a pandemic. That's the misplacement of our priorities. That's a lack of understanding about the image of God and about human dignity. I pray that we'll come back to that.
Thank you. So let me ask, given the nature, I was going to ask this question for both of you, given the nature of how we are as a country right now, however one interprets that, for much of our history, the promise of the American dream has been it's been the dream, right? I mean, and so many immigrants, all of us are immigrants to this country, one way or the other, some forcefully, some voluntarily, but
Right.
The American dream was always that if I work hard enough, if I pursue my dreams enough, I can make it in this country and make something of myself. Do you think the American dream is still real, still a possibility in our country?
I serve a God of possibilities. So I think everything is real if we have the will. Everything is about human will. See, I think America is a country of innovation and possibilities. I mean, whoever thought that we would be able to put a phone in our hand and talk to people halfway across the world, around the world, right? So.
And now I wish I could just put the phone down.
And now we're stuck with it, right?
Right.
We die if we lose it.
Yeah.
But, so I believe it is possible. I pray for what would be a revival of values in our churches about what really matters to God. So that we could come back and say, okay, people are talking now about normal. Let's return to normal. Well, normal didn't work for everybody. Okay, so I would like for us to envision, now that we're in this situation where it seems like we're in this forever pandemic, right? This surreal pandemic, to dream a bit about what would equality look like? What would healed economy look like? What would work look like? What does church look like? I'm saying in a crisis, you have an opportunity, since all of a sudden we had church and now church is home. Now we're having church in our PJs, right? Many of us, right? Not you. You have to be preaching every
No, I wear a dress, but because
But I think in a way, crisis is really an opportunity. And if we would take this opportunity to say, this pandemic or plague is not going to last forever. So let's think now about what should schooling look like? What should work look like? How do we address the income inequality between women and men, between people of color and whites? How do we address those inequalities where essential workers have been disadvantaged? How do we address some of those issues going forward?
So Michelle just flashed me the card that is 5 minutes left. I cannot believe we've already talked for 25 minutes. It's like, where did this time go?
I did most of the talking.
No, but still, I've got all these other places I want to go. But let's just cut to the chase. So you've talked about this, but let's go directly to it. What do you think, what should the Christian do? What should the average person in the pew who cares about these issues do? Some would argue that what we need to do is we need to be changing other people's hearts so that their hearts are more aware of the needs of the poor and the systemic issues. And then individuals will change what needs to change, where others would say, perhaps, no, what we need to do is affect public policy as Christians. What should the church do?
We should be doing both. We should be teaching the 2,000 verses of scriptures on God's preferential concerns for the poor. Teach the whole gospel. Teach what Jesus says about it. Make that part of our prescription for going forward. And then to say, what therefore can the church do? Look around your own community. I dare say you're in a largely white community, but I'll bet there's some distressed white people over here. So we have a lot of work to do. So we don't want to stop doing, I don't want to belittle what I call symptoms. Symptoms is good ministry work, okay? Right. Keep feeding the poor. Keep doing the tutorials.
Loving the person in front of you.
Love whoever's in front of you.
Yeah.
But look to the broader system that has a lot of evil intent in it, greed in it, inequalities in it, and say, what can the church collective do? Get out of the Republican Democratic bag and say, how can we think about not just a food drive, but a policy that deals with food issues, feeding people across the country. There are food deserts in the country. How do we address that? There are some places in the country where there are no stores, all across the country. The church has a responsibility to do what? Feed my sheep. Feed my lamb. That's what the Word of God says.
Amen. I agree. Could not agree more. So can you think of two things, I think we talked about this, two things, two policies, two action items that you think are really important?
I think one is the wealth inequality issue. And right now, Senator Wyden and Senator Elizabeth Warren have a bill to have a 2% tax on billionaires. Now, you know Zuckerberg is not going to miss 2%, right? Okay, so the billionaires are not going to miss it, but it would make a difference right now for people who have very little. Now, I'm not saying that that's the only thing that needs to happen, but the wealth gap has got to be addressed in some way. The other issue is voting. Our democracy will be lost if we can't vote. If students can't vote because their ID doesn't count, if the elderly can't vote because we make it harder, or disabled people can't vote because we remove all the drop boxes and mail-in ballots, which are happening in 400 laws in 49 states, I think the church has some business to do with that. That's not political. That's about justice. And justice is God's business.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. William Skinner. It's a pleasure having you with us, and it'll be great to bring you back in a few minutes, but Absolutely. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
Dr. Brooks, please come on up.
Wait a minute, I gotta
Are you hooked on?
I pull myself apart here.
There you go. See you in a minute.
Okay.
How are you?
Good to see you. Thank you.
Nice to see you too. I can take this off here.
Please do, yes. So let me start by doing a little, just what I did with Dr. William Skinner. Let me read a little bit of your background, of your much condensed bio here for folks, just so they'll know. Dr. Arthur Brooks is the William Henry Bloomberg Professor of the Practice of Public Leadership at the Harvard Kennedy School and Professor of Management Practice at the Harvard Business School. Before joining the Harvard faculty in July of 2019, he served for 10 years as president of the DC-based American Enterprise Institute, AEI, one of the world's leading think tanks. He is the author of 12 books, I didn't realize 12 books, including the national bestsellers, Love Your Enemies, one of my favorites, and The Conservative Heart, as well as the forthcoming book, From Strength to Strength, to be published just next month. He is a columnist for The Atlantic, host of the podcast How to Build a Happy Life with Arthur Brooks, and subject of the 2019 documentary film The Pursuit, which Variety named as one of the best documentaries on Netflix in August of 2019. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. What a wonderful, beautiful place.
It's not a bad place to have a conversation.
Not
is
bad
it?
at all, and what a nice conversation to have in this beautiful place.
It's a little echoey, but it works. I'm a big fan of your books,
Thanks.
of your writing, and I'm so grateful for you being with us. Tell us a little bit about the new book.
The new book that comes out next month is called From Strength to Strength. I teach a class on happiness at the Harvard Business School. People ask, what do you teach at HBS? And they think I'm going to say accounting or finance or marketing or something. And I say I teach happiness, and they think I'm lying. But the truth is that learning how to build a happier life for yourself and the people that you lead seems almost self-evident, but it's been lost for a lot of leaders and communities and churches and business and certainly in politics. And my great vocation is to bring the joy that can and should come from life back into leadership so that we can lift each other up and bring each other together.
I look forward to reading the book. Of course, I haven't seen it. I always equate the deepest happiness with being a sense of joy.
This is certainly a Christian conception of joy,
Yeah.
and you and I as Christians, we think of these moments of happiness that we have, these moments that catches our breath, that we think of as this little bit of the beatific vision that we're assured that we'll have when we pass into heaven. And trying to describe that to people who are not believers is a little tricky sometimes too. But the good news is that there's been this explosion of research, brain science and social science research on how happiness, we can learn more about it, we can practice it, get better at it. That's why I wrote this current book, but this is what I'm doing, this is what I'm teaching. What a joy it is for me, especially as a Christian, because the aim and final end of what we're doing is try to bring people to greater joy. Of course, the origin of that is faith in our Lord.
And you're I know you're a man of very deep faith, and if I'm correct, you go to Mass almost every day.
Yeah, I'm Catholic, and one of the great things about being a Catholic, there's many great things about being a Catholic. I recommend it to everybody I can meet. And part of it is because we have this wonderful franchise system in which the product is the same on every street corner practically, and furthermore that the product is available every single day. And it's the most important thing in my life is my Christian faith. And there's something that's my greatest consolation, something I can count on, and something that really has given my life shape and purpose. Like, I don't think anything else, I'm quite sure nothing ever could.
So tell us a little bit about your faith background, how your faith has influenced sort of where you are now. Did you grow up as a person of faith? Is it something you've always had as a part of your life?
Both sides of my family, my mother and my father, come from evangelical backgrounds and from missionary evangelical backgrounds of that. My grandfather was the director of a mission school in the Navajo Nation where my father was born. Later, the dean of students at Wheaton College in Illinois.
Oh, yes.
My father taught at Seattle Pacific, where I grew up. My mother comes from a Southern Baptist background, so a very strong evangelical background.
And academics as well, it sounds like background.
Yeah, artists and academics on both sides. And I had a semi-mystical experience at the Shrine of Guadalupe in Mexico when I was a teenager, and I converted shortly before my 16th birthday, as a matter of fact, and it was of great distress to my parents. It was really alarming to my parents. But in the end, they figured it was adolescent rebellion. Fair conclusion, but they decided it's probably better than drugs. So they gave in, and it was a peaceful coexistence after that. And my Catholic faith has been the greatest gift of my life. I married a woman who was baptized Catholic, not practicing in Barcelona, a Spaniard, and who, when she moved to the States after we got married, we were married in Barcelona. When we came to the States, she found the joy of her own Catholic faith, and now she's the one who leads me in paths of righteousness.
Wow, that's wonderful.
Yeah.
What a great blessing. Where'd you grow up, by the way?
Seattle, Washington.
Oh, in Seattle.
Yeah. Seattle, Washington. So Barbara and I are both West Coasters.
Well, we're great to have you on this coast, let me tell you.
Delighted to be here.
So, as someone with your background, let me just ask, what is going on in our economy today? Right? I mean, how would you describe the state of our economy, and how did we get to where we are today?
Our economy is always has been and always will be a downstream understanding of our culture. So the economy is a cultural phenomenon. It's not as if that the economy drives the culture drives the economy. And the result of that is that when we have a lot of polarization, a lot of dispute, a lot of inability to understand each other culturally, that's going to be reflected in our economic patterns as well. So for example, when we have a lot more solidarity, we'll tend to have economic policies that tend to be more inclusive. People will forget the inclusion that's a human necessity. That's both a privilege and an obligation as brothers and sisters. They'll forget that in their economy when we've forgotten that in our society. And so the result of that is that if we want a better economy, we need more sisterhood and brotherhood in our culture. And the economy will reflect that. So what we regret in our economy today is really what we regret in our politics, what we regret in our communities, what we regret in our overarching sociology that we see in this country. And it's really all related in this way. But I think it has deep roots. This is not, a 5-year-old phenomenon or even a 10-year-old phenomenon. We're having a conversation about the roots of inequality and poverty in America. And I think Barbara hit the nail on the head when she talked about the problem that we have of a misunderstanding of the equality of human dignity is really at the root of that. There's the visionary Roman Catholic cardinal of Chicago for many years, Cardinal Francis George. I'm sure you knew him, and he was really the intellectual leader of the Catholic Church in America. Died about 5 years ago of cancer. But he had a famous line that he would use when he talked to his donors. So he would go to the North Shore of Chicago, and where the wealthiest people in Chicago live, to raise money for his Catholic charities on the south side of Chicago, which is a poorer place. And he would always famously say, don't forget that the poor need you to pull them out of poverty. And don't forget that you need the poor to keep you out of hell. Now that's a gutsy move in fundraising, and I've raised a lot of money in my time, and I've never used that line, I have to say. But when I first heard that, it made me think, do we need the poor? Do we really need the poor as people? See, this is the thing. If you want a society based on dignity, you need interlocking need. You want to know who's got dignity? The people you need. You want to know the people you treat with dignity? The people you need. You know the people that you don't treat with dignity? They're not the assets, they're the liabilities. They're the people that you manage. You manage your liabilities, you cultivate your assets. You treat with dignity the people that you need in our society. And this is the basis of the problem. So I look back on it and I think, okay, we obviously have a dignity gap. I would say that the framing of our conversation about the wealth gap is not quite right. I think it should be based on the dignity gap. That's the bigger problem. That's undergirding all of it. And if I go back to the beginning of when we tried to systemically solve poverty problems in America, back to 1964, back to the beginning of the war on poverty with Lyndon Johnson, he went to Inez, Kentucky, one of the poorest places in America, where people didn't have running water, they didn't have electricity, people were malnourished. And he said, today I declare a war on poverty, and our goal is total victory. And you and I would be standing on our chairs cheering. When he got back to Washington, D.C., he put a general in charge of that war, Sergeant Shriver, a truly great American, a truly great patriot, who also was behind, the Peace Corps. He's an amazing man. His son, Mark Shriver, was my next door neighbor when I lived here in Bethesda. and they were parishioners at my church, as a matter of fact. And Sergeant Shriver was asked, okay, what's the goal of the war on poverty? You know what he said? Dignity, not doles. So what did we get? What did we get since 1964? I dare say we got lots of doles and not very much dignity. We got the opposite of what the great man and the President of the United States wanted. We spent $20 trillion in the war on poverty, and the poverty rate has basically stayed constant at somewhere between 12 and 15%. That is failure in any sector of the economy besides government. And that's a big problem that we should all regret. So how is it that we're still treating poor people like liabilities to manage and rich people like assets to develop? How is it that we as people would never treat our kids, who, by the way, are the closest poor people to any of us? So love the poor, love your kids, because they're the closest poor people in, it's funny, I've got 3 adult kids. And when they were little, I would say, 60% of my household is unproductive. They're takers, right? But I didn't treat them like liabilities to manage. I treated them like assets to develop, and yet we're incapable of treating, like Barbara quite correctly points out, we are incapable of treating other people's kids as if they were our kids, as assets as assets to develop, as opposed to liabilities to manage. And this has been the animating force in my own work against poverty. Every poverty policy should not be just equalizing the wealth gap. That doesn't do the trick. That's not the problem. The problem is we don't believe in the radical equality of human dignity, and that offends me as an American, and as a person, and as a Christian.
I couldn't agree with you more, but if you believe in the radical dignity of every human being, shouldn't you be working towards some sort of equality of not only of dignity, but quality of opportunity, quality of life enjoyment, so to speak, of happiness, right?
Sure, absolutely. And one of the most interesting things that we find is when people have an adequate standard such as that they can support themselves, not in poverty, but at lower middle class levels, and even below that, they can be just as happy, is what we find. The happiness is not the problem. The problem is when people have, as you correctly point out, inadequate access to the tools of opportunity. They cannot lift themselves up. You know, this is the amazing thing about this country, and again, I just agree so much with what Dr. William Skinner has been talking about here. You know, this is a country of will. You know what we all have in common in this country? It's the most extraordinary thing. That, you know, I've lived in Spain, and, you know, we've all, you know, spent a lot of time abroad, and this is the only country that's founded by ambitious riffraff, and where we're all descended from it. We're all just, you know, some people scratching out potatoes in Ireland 3 generations ago, or running from some godforsaken shtetl, or brought to this country involuntarily. But we're all descended from ambitious riffraff, and we're proud of it. It's the most amazing thing. We have to realize that that is the riffraffiness is the basis of the equality of our dignity. And that's the basis upon which we should have an equal opportunity society, notwithstanding any differences above a certain level, of course, in the material circumstances in which I find ourselves. But when we're wrapped around the axle about wealthy people having too much, we're missing the point that actually brings this human dignity. Now, I understand that there are public services that we have to pay for, and one of the great, I'm a proponent of the free enterprise system, and the greatest fruit of the free enterprise system in America is the welfare system, is the fact that we can equalize wealth across need, that we can serve our brothers and sisters who are in desperate need, whom we've never even met. That is only because of the largesse of capitalism. Only capitalism has made that possible in the history of the world. I'm so grateful for that. And I think that it's really, really important that we do that. And we remember that the welfare state is critically important to do that. But we also have to design a welfare state that doesn't squeeze the dignity out of an entire class of people such that the rest of us can kind of take care of them like charity cases. That offends the notion of equal opportunity. Exactly right. And that's I think that is at the root of the problem that we see today.
So what are public policies that you would think would be beneficial, or that should be continued or increased or changed that would benefit?
So to begin with, we have a terribly broken education system in this country that's not adequate to our needs and is completely unequal. Not unequal in money. If you go to the District of Columbia, for example, they spend a tremendous amount of money per student in the District of Columbia, but they don't have the kind of outcomes that would suggest that they have equally equal quality in the education that they're providing to children. Poor children get short shrift in education in America, and we all know that. Why do we permit something like this? Now, where does this start? This starts with this notion that we have an education system that if we just have a kind of a uniform, stamp it out kind of a product, that it's going to be fine for all different communities that come from different places with different circumstances and different backgrounds, which is sort of self-evidently wrong. We don't treat our own kids that way, once again. But it's also a classist system that is simply trying to get everybody ready to the prize of American life, regrettably, which is apparently going to college. You know, this is misguided. You know, the whole idea that we have, for example, we have unfilled jobs and unemployment existing in the same economy. This is the answer to one of your questions, which is one of the problems that we have in America today. When we don't treat people with equal dignity, we don't train them to do what's needed because we feel that some people are simply not needed. As such, we'll have an economy that has, for example, high-skilled manufacturing jobs that go unfilled and unemployed people alongside of them who have had an inadequate education preparing them for potentially doing something that's deeply necessary in our economy in the first place. This is another way that the economy reflects the culture.
Well, that raises one of my other questions, which I was going to come to later, but is, since the pandemic, we've seen, a huge number of people who've walked away from their jobs,
right,
who've sort of had an awakening about, I just don't want to do this anymore. But we've also seen a great inability to fill positions that had been filled before the pandemic. What do you attribute that to?
Well, this has everything to do with the fact that work is a highly social act. In the work that I do on the research that I do on human happiness, there's a million studies about the habits of the happiest people, right? Millions. What do happy people do? What are the practices that happy people have? And 10,000 studies. And if you boil the ocean, it really comes down to 4 things. Happy people do 4 things. They put a deposit in 4 accounts every day: faith, family, friends, and work that serves others, and where they can earn their success. The big 4: faith, family, friends, and work. That's it. I mean, everything else is sort of derivative or not necessarily even trivial, but not central to this value proposition of your happiness habits is what it comes down to. So what is it about work that is inherently fulfilling? It's creating value with others. Well, guess what happened in the coronavirus epidemic? We all went home, not everybody. We had essential workers who turned out mostly were highly satisfied with their work during the coronavirus epidemic, if you look at the data. Because they got to keep working, and they got to serve others, and they got to keep working with others. Now, I don't want anybody to be put at particular risk, but I have to recognize the fact that there's a reason that they had relatively high job satisfaction during the pandemic. And that's the same reason that people who are not working with others lowered their life satisfaction, their work satisfaction during the pandemic. 50% of your compensation, or 70% or 20%, depending on the person, of the compensation is not money. It's being with people. It's creating value with other people. And when companies are coming along and saying, hey, I had this incredible, it's like the scales have fallen from my eyes. I can put everybody on Zoom. I don't have to rent an office. I can save tons of money. Stay home. And people are like, you just lowered my salary. I can't even articulate it, but I don't like this job anymore. I can't tell you exactly why I don't like this job anymore. Bye-bye. That's what's happening. Look, we have this incredible wave of mental illness coming toward us right now, like a tidal wave, from depression, from solitude, from anxiety, all sort of based in loneliness. We have this great Surgeon General, Vivek Murthy, President Biden's Surgeon General. His last book is about the biggest public health crisis that we face, which is not the pandemic, which is not opioids, it's loneliness. And we just made it worse through misguided policies and the continuance of this idea that whatever we do, let's just not get back together in person.
And yet, you're finding that a lot of employers are terrified that if they don't have liberal work from home policies moving forward, that they can't stay competitive for these jobs, that many white collar workers are demanding the ability to be able to not come into the office as often.
It's a real conundrum that we've uncovered, and part of that is because bodies at rest tend to stay at rest. It's sort of the physics of the pandemic.
Inertia, yeah.
It's a real problem, as a matter of fact, and what we find is that loneliness, for example, and solitude tends to inhibit the executive functions of the brain. And so when you feel lonely and sad, you say, well, I think I'll curl up on the couch with a pint of ice cream and Netflix by myself, when what you should do is call a friend. Well, the same sort of thing happens collectively, where people actually are not doing what they need to do for adequate self-care, when they're lonely and depressed, when there's this subtle dysthemic depressive state that's rolling across our economy because of the enforced loneliness and solitude that came from our COVID policies. And now we're going to reap the bitter fruit.
So you think much of the desire to work from home is faddish or temporary or unhealthy? I
think it's unhealthy. I think there are all kinds of reasons that certain people can and should work from home, and I think we need more flexibility. And
sure.
And necessity is the mother of invention.
Right.
Most of the really great, many of the great innovations in economy and society have actually come as a result of crisis, because people had to innovate suddenly, and we're going to see a lot more flexibility, and that's a good thing. But the degree to which we see it, we're going to see an overcorrection when people are actually voluntarily making their workforce decisions, their own workplace decisions, as a matter of fact. And many people are not going to be doing what's in their, I believe, as a happiness researcher, I believe people are not going to be doing what's in their greatest self-interest. And I really worry about that a lot.
That's really interesting. Well, let me ask you a question that I asked Dr. William Skinner. What do you think the state is of the American dream right now?
I think the American dream when it comes to the economic possibilities, is as great as it's ever been. But I think that the American dream economically should and always will be subservient to the culture that we create for ourselves. So it's interesting, you know, I ask people, I know a lot of wealthy people, and so do you, because I've raised money in communities and for causes. And a lot of wealthy people are incredibly unhappy. They're incredibly unhappy. And I've asked people, you know, who are wealthy, I say, you know, how can you still be unhappy? You got your dream came true. Your dream came true. And one person told me, he said, it's a funny thing, you don't realize until you're wealthy that you have a lot of money and your wife still doesn't love you. You have a lot of money and your kids still don't respect you. You have a lot of money and you still you have deal friends, but you don't have real friends. And that is the problem with an American dream that's every bit as able to create the wealth that we desire and the innovation that people admire. But at the same time, we don't have love for each other. You know, here's the problem. We can do almost anything, even under the most adverse circumstances. But we're a country living by lies. And the greatest lie that we're living under right now, as far as I'm concerned, is the lie that more than 50% of Americans embrace, in my view. Well, no, it's a lie in my view, but I know, according to fact, that it's true that more than 50% of Democrats and 50% of Republicans think the biggest threat our country faces is people who don't vote like them. That is an astounding lie. And that's what's going to tear us apart. We will be able to cultivate the American dream of prosperity and growth and eye-popping inventions. And if we hate each other, if we're incapable of loving each other, if the church is incapable of actually combating that, then what good are we?
That raises my other question, because we only have a few minutes. Really, one of the most important, as far as I'm concerned, I asked this of Dr. Barbara Williams Skinner, what is the role of the church? What is the role of the Christian in the midst of this?
So, you know, there has been a time when the church delivered. When the church, and there was a time, it wasn't perfect, because this country's never been perfect. But there was a time when the country was more torn apart and then came more together. And this was a time when the temperance movement and the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and the evangelicals and the African American churches were rolling through the country, you know, in the post-Civil War era, before the First World War. And by the way, contemporaneously with secular movements of self-improvement, Dale Carnegie, and, you know, and just these ideas that you can be the boss of you and your life. Was it imperfect? Was it unequal? For sure. But what did that do? That gave this promise of the American spirit. This gave this optimism, this aspiration to it. And it was not just that the churches were incidental to it. On the contrary, American Christianity is this funny creed that God says, you can be, you should be the master of your life. And only then can you offer up your life to the Savior. And that's what we need to do. And that starts not with, look, I'm a public policy guy. I suffered through a PhD in public policy. I ran a public policy think tank. I teach at the Harvard Kennedy School, public policy, but this is not a public policy issue. It is time for the churches to bring souls to Christ, because that is the source of happiness. This is the enlightenment that we need. Then other things will come from it. Look, the church,
another great awakening in this country.
This is what we need. There is no substitute. We need a great awakening in this country, which will torque our culture, and that will change our economy. That's what we need. We need souls.
And hence your notion that the economy follows as a society.
That is correct.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, let's bring Dr. Barbara Williams Skinner back up and have some more conversation. How are we doing, Michelle? Oh, it's 8 on the nose, and we're doing great.
Very good.
So why don't we start with a question? Do we have a question from our viewers?
We do. Give me, if you
Oh,
got
I'm
one
sorry.
ready to go, give me a sec to get set.
Okay.
That's great.
As you take the liberal side of our country, the Republican, the Democrat, the conservative side of our country, the Republicans, the Democrats, how do we learn from each other? How do we lift up what's best about each other, rather than what you're talking about, which I thought was very profound and very true, that the greatest fear we have is someone who votes differently than we do. How do we get beyond that in such a way that we can heal as a nation and then heal economically and in other ways?
You have to start with seeing God in other people. I mean, it's like, if you don't look like me, think like me, vote like me, act like me, I can't dismiss you. If I don't see the image of God in you, then I'm not interested in your politics. I'm not interested in your values. I've got to get past that. I got to get back to how God sees me. It's just about loving God and your neighbor as yourself, really. That's the fundamental. That's the great commandment. I think that's why it is the great commandment. Because if I don't do that, then I'm always in a box, a category box. I'm always in a tribe. And my tribe has got to win over your tribe. It's a zero-sum game. If I win, you lose. I can't do that unless I see you and I on the same team. We're on the human family. That's the team we're on.
There's very little of value to add to that. Because that's the Christian message in a nutshell. And this is, the interesting thing is that when you honestly believe that you're made in God's image, and so are all of the people, which, by the way, is biblical thinking. I don't see any other way around that conclusion when reading the Bible. Then you have to be, if you're grateful for God, you're grateful for your neighbor. And how do you express gratitude? How does one express gratitude? By listening to somebody else. It's interesting, I was talking to a group of Republicans in Congress, all of the senators and all the members of the House of Representatives on the Republican side in one place, in a retreat some years ago. And I asked a question: how many of you wish we lived in a one-party state? No hands. And if it were Democrats, it would also be no hands. One-party state. No American wants to live in it's not Cuba, Venezuela. Okay. I said, okay, how many of you are grateful that we have a multi-party, at least a two-party democracy? Every hand. You just told me you're grateful for the Democrats. You just told me that you're grateful, axiomatically, that you're grateful for Democrats. It's time for us to be grateful for people who disagree with us. Look, we live in the freest, most pluralistic, prosperous, upwardly mobile, charitable society in the history of the world. That's America. Right. Imperfect, but to be ungrateful for what we have and for our society, to be ungrateful for the people who disagree with us, it's this colossal hubris. It is this unchristian gratitude that we have. Be grateful for the American who disagrees with you, because you might just be wrong. And in case you are, it'd be better to know it first as opposed to last.
How do you get people to go from what you just said, what I totally agree with, to getting to know one another?
Yeah.
Because this is a theory until I invite you to a conversation to get to know you and understand. You just stated some things different from the way I stated them, right? So I need I need time with you to understand, how did you get to that point of view?
Yeah. So I'm bringing coals to Newcastle by telling a theologian this. You know this better than I do. We just met and we have love for each other. Why? Because we have a shared refracted love for the Lord. That's our shared love. Aristotle said that. The perfect friendship is one where there's a shared love for a third divine, a third thing. Maybe it's baseball, right? But you know when it's really good? It's when it's the most important thing in the universe. You know how you get people to appreciate each other and to know each other and to have friendship and listen to each other and maybe even love each other? Shared love for God. Shared love for... It's interesting that how love works. I've done these studies where I bring people together who are just like the 5% left-wing Democrats and the 5% right-wing Republicans. I'm like at the ideologically in the center, right? So I'm really interested in this. And I want to know, how do you bring them together? You know how you bring them together? You start the conversation not talking about Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump. You bring them together by asking them to tell each other about their kids.
Right.
That's how you do it, because it's a shared love. And then if they have teenage kids, it's like a shared enemy. So they get the foxhole mentality. And
those freeloaders again, right?
Those takers. But that's love. That's the astonishing power of love, and that's the message of the gospel. And that's how you do it. The shared love for something bigger and better than us.
Why is it so hard for us today? Because we're more divided now than we were, I'm going to say, since the Civil War. Because we're
the data back you up, by the way.
I'm sorry?
The data show that you're correct.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking now about another civil war. We're talking now as if we really want to annihilate one another. And this is among Christians.
Yes. Why do you think it is?
I think because we never have started with the basic value, all people. We haven't reckoned, there's never been a reckoning with the fact that we stole a country, enslaved a bunch of people, disregarded the Chinese, put people, we haven't said we want to include everybody. It's just like you have an argument with your spouse or with a friend. You may not even say anything, but it's there. The spirit of division is still there. We have to have a conversation about the things. You didn't do it. I didn't do it. I'm not asking you for an apology. I'm asking us to say, this isn't the way we still want to carry on. You can't pretend that we didn't harm a lot of people and then act like, okay, let's go on from here. We can't do that, because the spirit of the evil that happened is still there. Okay, it's still there.
So how do we get people? I agree with both of you on so many of the things that you've said, but we tend to exist in our own echo chambers, right? I mean, we tend to exist with our own television shows that we're Fox. I mean, Fox or MSNBC
right.
or whatever it is. We exist in our own echo chambers, and so not only is it a matter of how do we love one another, but we're not even around the people we ought to be listening to, or the folks that really need to hear one another are the last people in the world who would listen to one another. How do we move that ball? How do we move that further down the road? That seems to me to be the great. Even here, when I'm preaching to folks, how many times am I preaching to folks who already think like I do? Right? I mean, how do we reach each other?
You got to create an environment, a safe environment, for people to feel that they're not at stake. They're not under attack. And I think that's what you're doing. So the people in this church, this wonderful church, probably all kind of look alike, have the same background. But what if you created some forums where they had an opportunity to talk about our kids, not our teenagers.
Good too.
But whatever we have in common, if we don't have the opportunity to be together, then I always have you as a category box, white male. That's not who you are. You have a birthday, you're maybe married, you have interests, you're a gardener, you like baseball. I don't know those things, and I never will get to know that.
Right.
Because I'm not in the shared space with you. I've got to create, as you did with friends, a shared space. That's our responsibility.
I think a safe space is important.
A safe space to actually say what's on your heart without being judged. That's what we need.
Well, that's a tricky thing with American institutions today. I teach at a university, which is a troubled kind of institution because of the illiberality, the cancel culture that we see, which basically, woe be unto the person who speaks her or his mind inappropriately at many universities today. And the truth is, people are afraid. People are afraid to say what they think. They could lose their ability to earn a living. if they say the things that they think. And that's, again, this is a fruit of a culture that basically takes ideological differences and blows them up into an existential war. When do we do that? That's when, I dare say, that's when we start taking ideology and politics and putting them in a place where religion is supposed to occupy. It's supposed to occupy in our lives. We know, in point of fact, that religion has been in decline in America for decades. And when religion is in decline, as David Foster Wallace one time said, people are going to worship something. Everybody worships something.
Right.
And if we're not doing our jobs in the churches as Christians, getting the gospel in front of people, look, this is what matters. This is what's really crucial. Politics is politics. But the gospel is, this is your soul that's at stake. Until we get that in front of people, and then they'll bring their religion to whatever secular. We'll have crusades on political terms, and people can't share what they think, and they will insulate themselves, and they won't have courage. They won't talk about the things that they think because it's too dangerous for them to do so.
You know, when 9/11 happened, I know a lot of people. I used to live in New York. And I remember immediately the country came together, even for a millisecond, to do what? Whether you were Muslim or Jewish or Christian or whatever, people, gathered together. Now, here we are, we're having another crisis, a pandemic, right? And we're not doing that. You know why? Because the church is part of the problem. We're part of the division. So I can't say the church, I have to now state me, okay? So let me take responsibility for what I, Barbara Williams Skinner, can do. Each one of us has to look in ourselves and say, what is my responsibility? Now that I know Arthur Brooke, okay, now that I know you, why don't we find a way to create where my friends get to know you, your friends get to know me. I mean, you have to take people who you already know who are different from you, right? And broaden that space. It's not going to happen through Fox or CNN,
no, you're right.
or MSNBC. It's going to happen with real breathing people like us deciding we don't want another civil war.
Breaking bread together.
We have to break bread together. And that's our will. We can do that. We have the ability to do that.
There's also a leadership issue too. And so each of us as individuals for sure have opportunity to do that. But we need leaders dedicated to this as well. Look, this is a country that politically is being driven by the 5% margins at the federal level. And we're not at the 93% of Americans say they hate how divided we become as a country, according to More in Common. It's a group that Tim Dixon has got that does this fabulous research. 93% of Americans hate how divided we become as a country. Remember that old, Occupy idea? We're the 99%. I don't know. I wasn't part of that 99%. I like rich people and poor people and everybody else. I don't like the class divisions in that. But let me tell you, I am the 93% that's trying to drive us apart. Look, when we hate, somebody's making money. Somebody's getting votes. Somebody's getting clicks. Somebody's getting followers. Somebody's profiting from that. We're the 93%, and we need leaders that represent us. That's what we need. We need actual presidents of the United States that are not trying to drive us apart. And they could look at something like the pandemic, which is, look, we're the most entrepreneurial faith. We're Christians. What do Christians believe? That when everybody else says it's a tragedy, we say it's an opportunity for transcendence. That's the essence of how Christians behave. That's St. Paul's message. You're miserable? Hallelujah. You're closer to God. Okay, so we have this COVID, we have this coronavirus pandemic that's hurting the whole world, and we don't have a president of the United States when this thing that breaks out that doesn't say, this is an opportunity to bring Americans together. And we still don't have a federal government that's capable of not vilifying people of different points of view. We're driving each other apart when we should be bringing each other together in our shared concern for each other and our shared misery over the circumstances.
Yeah. There are 100 million people who say they are Christian. So yes, the president could do it, and that would be great. But we have 350,000 churches according to the Gallup poll, right?
True. Yeah.
That's a lot of leaders who already have a pulpit and an access and membership and outreach and Zoom and network. So I'm not giving the church a pass. I think it starts right with us.
Amen.
Amen. Well, speaking of that, let's hear from some of those folks. I think we've had some, you guys are doing so great. I was just going to go over here and sit down. You guys are doing so, have such a good conversation. How about some questions from folks watching at home?
Yeah, I've got a couple of questions here. These first two, I'm just gonna ask them both and let you have some conversation, circling back to this question about the economy and poverty. And so the first one is, and I think you've touched on this, but maybe digging in a little bit deeper, how can we as Christians, and I think you could also expand that beyond Christians to people of faith, people of values, support this paradigm shift of regarding and treating those who struggle with poverty as assets to cultivate versus liabilities to manage? So how do churches, Christians, faith communities help us shift to see people as assets? And then the second one is, if you're, the writer is asking about Heather McGhee's book, The Sum of Us, in which she suggests that this is not a zero-sum game where some win and some lose.
Right.
But there is a solidarity benefit to ensuring that people, she takes the entire book a long way to get here, but essentially that the solidarity benefit happens when we all do well. And if we're ensuring that the least of these are doing well, then we actually, if we have policies that ensure that we all do better, is her thesis. So if you haven't read the book, you don't have to respond specifically to her thesis, but I think there's a question there about how is the well-being of some connected to the well-being of all?
So that's two big questions,
Yeah.
obviously.
Right.
Yeah, and you have
Where do you want to start?
13 minutes.
Yeah, we got 13 minutes. Where do you want to start with that?
Okay. So I think it really still goes back to what people see is what they believe. Tragically, the church is as Dr. Martin Luther King said, the most segregated institution on the planet right now, on Sunday morning at 11 o'clock. So I think if people would begin to see people, right, of all backgrounds and races together, poor people, rich people, middle income, whatever, the diversity of people, that would be a beginning to say we all matter. See, we can preach it from the mountaintop, but until people see the embodiment of everybody matters, the image of God in all of us is embodied. I think it's just a lot of talk until that happens.
I want to ask something about that, because you talked earlier about the importance of ministries, feeding ministries, tutoring ministries. I've run across people, and I've experienced this myself too sometimes, that if all we're doing is ministry, it's condescending. If all we're doing is, so how do we do ministry in a way that is uplifting and doesn't contribute to this question of who's taking care of who? Does that question make sense? I've heard people sort of suggest that charity can complicate things for people who are offering charity because it creates a division.
I think the question is always, how do you take people from being recipients of care to standing on their own? Okay, I think that's what we're really talking about. How do you equip me? So the person who gave me a scholarship from a very poor family to college equipped me. So we have to equip people, as you said earlier, through education. You've got to, the education is really the beginning. It's the difference between poverty and non-poverty. It all across the world. So we have to look at how are we equipping poor children. And it's the tragedy right now is that even during the pandemic, we have lost 2 years of education with children in school virtually. So we have to find a way to target. It's a term we don't like to use, but you have to target people. If everybody's generally okay, but some people are having a disastrous time, then there's no common good in that. So we have to target those who are really hurting, the homeless, those who are they're out of their luck. We have to do that. I don't know if it's just the church or the government and the church, but we have to look at who is beaten and battered on the side of the road that the Samaritan helped. in the story that Jesus told in Luke 10. We have to do that. Who's beaten and battered today who needs help?
One response to that, I hear this a lot. The problem with charity is it makes there's a giver and a taker, and that creates a class division. I mean, but that's an incredibly materialistic view. We're all poor. We're all destitute. We're all impoverished. We live in the richest country in the history of the world, and I know some very, very rich people, or some middle-class people, and most Americans are not going to bed hungry, thank God, but many of them are poor. And this is the key thing to keep in mind. You see, I was giving a lecture at a Christian college in New York, right outside New York City, and I asked the students, I said, how can you show you need the poor? And they're like, no hands. It's okay. So you go into New York City, there's a lot of homeless people, huge homelessness crisis in New York City. Everybody knows that. It's a scandal. It's a disgrace. And when you have a responsibility, like my wife always says, she's always got the cars full of food, right? Because it's a dangerous business giving out money to people who are homeless, because, there's a lot of homelessness advocates who talk about how this is really a problem. But my wife always gives food and like gift cards to restaurants and stuff like that. And I say, why always? Why always? And she says, because that's the face of Jesus. As you did for the least of these, my brothers and sisters, you did for me. That's not, as you did for something like the least of these, my brothers and sisters, or then as you did for somebody like me. No. It's very literal language, right? So she said, okay, I got that. Okay, then I said, so what do you do when you're in New York City? I asked the students, when you take that responsibility and you give that person something to eat, if not money? I don't know. Then you confess your own poverty by asking what you need from that poor person. And you know what you need from that homeless person, that homeless woman or man? You need his or her prayers. And you should say, please pray for me and my family. And you should mean it, because you are poor. And that homeless woman's prayers will reach the ears of the Lord. And if you don't believe it, you're not behaving like a Christian. If you don't think you're poor like that homeless person, you're not behaving like a Christian. That question of the classism in giver and taker is a materialistic question and not dignified of Christian life.
So you mean that in the sense that you're poor, I'm poor, we're poor in many different ways.
And if we don't my point is that if we don't remember our poverty in the face of economic poverty, shame on us. Shame on us. We're not paying attention, then we're thinking of ourselves as somehow better than others, and we're not recognizing our own nakedness.
Back to the issue of human sin again,
in
some ways.
Absolutely. It's also just this crass materialism that's endemic in human life, I dare say.
So how about this question, the zero-sum game? We all do better when we all do better. There's a solidarity dividend if we make sure that everybody has what they need, if we think about our world in that way. And I think this might be the last one, and then Randy, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
That's a tough place to leave it, but the zero-sum game, once again, is let's not limit this to economic questions. Mm-hmm. Let's not limit this to money. And the truth of the matter is that if you're just talking about money, then it's ridiculous that when there's any inequality, we're all worse off, is a ridiculous assertion that doesn't make any sense. I, in point of fact, want entrepreneurs to be able to make tons of money and to innovate and create millions of jobs. It gives me great joy, because this is what lifts up our economy without the heavy hand of government being involved, and that's great. And by the way, I saw a survey asking, what's your view on Bill Gates, when Bill Gates was the richest man in the world, some years ago. He's still plenty wealthy. And the average American response was basically, I hope my kid is the next Bill Gates. I saw the same survey, it was fielded in France. And the answer was basically, let's take his stuff and burn his house down. We're not an envious culture. And envy, there's 2 commandments against envy. That's how bad it is, right? Let's not be an envious culture. Let's make sure that people have enough for a dignified standard of living, and let's equalize opportunity radically, and then let's not worry about the rest of these economic issues. That's what I propose.
I think it is important to have a system where everybody has an opportunity to succeed. It is not an opportunity if it's stacked in a way that some people not only succeed, but they get more than they should have. I do think wealth inequality is an issue. I am not against people, nor is the Bible, nor is Jesus, having money. We need that. The country can't run if people aren't making things. We get that. But we do have a problem when we can find money quickly, a trillion or more quickly without blinking. We don't ask about inflation. We don't ask about the debt ceiling. We give it to those who are the wealthiest, who have already the power that they need without thinking. Now we're having a whole discourse for 4 years about families who can't feed their children during a pandemic. There's something wrong with that. There's an imbalance in that, and we have to address that in our country.
You two have been wonderful. Thank you so much for coming and taking part in this conversation where there are no easy answers into many of these things. And I think you both have spoken a great amount of truth. And I have learned a lot just being in your presence. So thank you. You have blessed us and you have blessed this cathedral by being here. And God bless you both in your work and in your ministries. And in your futures, and I hope you will come back and be with us again. We would be honored to have you both.
Thank you. Thank you, an honor to be here, and a delight to be with you.
You as well.
Thank you.
Again.
And thanks to all of you who have joined us. It's great to have you with us, and I hope wherever you are that you are safe and sound and well. And may God bless you and keep you and watch over all of you. Thank you for being with us tonight, and thank you, Michelle, for all that you do to make these happen. God bless you all. Thank you and good night.
If I could kill somebody with a word of love, if I could love somebody, it's done wrong, and my living will not be in vain. If I can do my duty as a good Christian law, if I can bring back beauty to a world of wrong, if I can spread love, justice, and love, then my living shall not be in vain. When my living shall not be in vain. Even my living shall not be in vain. Somebody has not passed along, and my living shall not be done.